Well, the next three chapters that we're going to be studying are going to be challenging. I think I have said this about other chapters, but these three really are uh, disturbing and challenge many of our deeply held beliefs. And the language you may find either difficult or offensive, particularly the discussions about masculinity in all three of these chapters. So I'm just giving you a heads up where I'm talking about chapters 5, 6, and 7, deviance in sports, violence in sports, and gender in sports, which we'll be studying next. And I also want you to understand that social scientists use language that is different, obviously, in many ways, very specific, and once again, that may be challenging for many of you. And I don't mean challenging to your intelligence and ability to understand the words. I mean how they are expressed, how the research on masculinity and violence and of that type of thing. So be as open as you can, and I've put up a lot of additional material for you this week to look at to help you to understand some of this. So we're starting with chapter 5 in deviance in sports. And the quote that I chose for this week from your text is history is clear. As long as there have been sports, people have bet on them and tried to fix them. So that starts and that's from Scott Eden, who from ESPN in 2019. So that's one aspect of deviance in sports is the whole betting industry and a variety of other things, and it's an addiction that is you know um, not only supported but encouraged in many cases by the people who profit from that addiction to gambling. But primarily this chapter deals with things other than betting. I mean, those things come up, but we're talking about other forms of deviance that are very powerful. So to begin, because media stories are so prevalent about on and off the field rule violations, criminal activities, like not legal betting, many people see deviance in sports as out of control. And I'm sure you've seen many of the media stories about this. So, since most people still believe in the great sports myth that, it encourages good behavior and health and good citizenship and all of that, you remember the great sports myth from chapter 1. Since so many people believe in that, they express outrage at the individuals that they perceive as the transgressors, and they demand punishment or banishment from sports to preserve sports as, and here is the great sports myth again, to preserve sports as inherent purity and goodness. Okay, so the point of this chapter and the purpose of it is to, once again, we do this with every chapter, apply sociological research and concepts to in this case, to deviance in sports. And it's going to focus on four major questions. First one is, what challenges do we face when studying deviance in sports? We just mentioned one. The great sports myth is a huge challenge because people don't want to hear about, deviance. Two, what is deviance? So we're going to look at the definition of deviance in general. What is deviance, and how does sociological knowledge help us understand it in sports as a social phenomenon? Three, are the rates of deviance in sports out of control? And four, what what has the use of performance enhancing substances, or excuse me, why has the use of performing enhancing substances become a persistent problem in many sports? So first, let's define uh, how we study deviance in sports. So here's an example, okay, that sociologists use in studying this. When a softball player punches an umpire, it's a deviant act because it violates a norm. Okay? Similarly, When a college coach hires prostitutes or when an Olympic judge alters scores, we know that deviance has occurred. Because in each case, norms, what makes life what we think of as normal, have been violated. So, what is a norm? It's a shared expectation that people use to identify what is acceptable and what is unacceptable in a social world, and also what's, quote, normal. That's where the word normal comes from. If you're normal, you're following the norms. If you're not normal, if you're a deviant in any way, a criminal, whatever, anything you can think of that's deviant, you are not technically, in just using the language, you are not normal. It's how we decide who's normal and who's not. Now, uh, so that's opposed to deviant. If we're well socialized, we follow the norms of our society. Let's just say in a Judeo-Christian society, the Ten Commandments, that type of thing, or the laws, the written laws, or the informal norms of the society. And if we don't follow them, then we are, quote, deviant in the sense that we are not normal in following the norms. Okay. So, norms exist in all social worlds and they serve as the standards of behavior, as I just said, both socially and legally, that are used to identify deviance. So, as I also just said, deviance occurs when person's ideas, traits, or actions and behaviors are perceived by others to fall outside the normal range of acceptance. So norms take different forms, as you might imagine, and they vary in importance. Some norms are, chewing food with your mouth closed is a norm, but it's much less important than thou shalt not kill as a norm, right? So they vary in importance. They change over time. A lot of the norms that we used to follow very, very, very strictly uh, have changed from, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And they differ from one culture and society to another. I'll give you an example of a norm that has changed. It's a very minor, unimportant, casual norm that has been changed over my lifetime, which is the relaxing in dress codes for women, even women in positions of power like presidential wives. You never, ever wore, for instance, this will shock many of you because it seems so silly, but you never wore sleeveless clothing unless it was an evening gown or something of that nature, or you were at the beach and it was summer and it was casual, but certainly never a sleeveless dress to, if you were in the public eye or that type of thing, or in a position of respect, let me put it that way, like a president's wife. So I've noticed that change from my childhood. When I was in school, you couldn't wear sleeveless clothes to school, and think what a difference that is now. So that's casual norm, but it's an example of how norms change. Okay. So, what formal norms are, and that was an informal norm. Formal norms are official expectations that take the form of written laws or rules. Here's some examples from sport. When a basketball players foul an opponent or shove a referee in anger, they violate norms that are written in the official rule book. That's an official norm. It's in a rule book, right? So norms are enforced by officials, right? Whether those are the sports officials or police or the military, that type of thing. They're enforced by officials with the authority to sanction, and I should say negatively sanction, because you can positively sanction someone too. We tend to think of sanctions as being negative because we use it loosely in our language that way. But negatively sanction is to punish somebody, and positively sanction somebody is to reward them for good behavior. So, okay. So they're enforced, these norms, official norms, are enforced by officials with the authority to sanction or punish violators. as I said, like law enforcement, for example, who have legal laws to back up their sanctioning. Informal norms, and I just mentioned a couple of them, the sleeveless clothing, the chewing with your mouth open, informal norms are customs, unwritten, shared understandings of how a person is expected to think, appear, and act. So here's some other examples. If two college basketball players don't face the flag, or if they take a knee during the national anthem, or they don't participate in a pre-game ritual, they violate unwritten informal norms or expectations of, quote, normal behavior. They're deviant in that sense. Okay? In response, of course, fans often deride players that don't meet expectations for togetherness and other sorts of things that of informal deviance. People get angry at them, they deride them, they make fun of them, they call them names, etc. So there are two forms of deviance, as we just said. Formal deviance, which is a violation of an official rule or law and is punished by official sanctions, and informal deviance involves a violation of unwritten custom or shared understandings, and it's punished by informal sanctions. But I wanted to explain in here something to you that isn't in the text, which is something called moral holidays. It's in all other sociology texts in this section about norms. There are, in societies, things called moral holidays where the normal rules, usually informal, right? Because if they were the formal rules, you'd be breaking the law, don't apply anymore. So Mardi Gras is an example. It's called a moral holiday. Normally, well, it does violate a formal law. Actually, the example I'm going to give you. Normally, if a woman runs around without her bra on, right, and her breasts exposed, there's going to be some sanction that comes down heavy on her, right? Either being arrested or a variety of other things. Streaking across game fields used to be very popular, and there were always pictures in the sociology textbooks of a cop on each side, or in this case it was in England, a bobby on each side escorting this naked guy off the field who was a streaker. That's an example of an informal number. Moral holidays are when you get, actually, in the case of Mardi Gras and bearing breasts, you get positively sanctioned. You get beads, right? So another example of a moral holiday is Easter week and the behavior of college students during Easter week. Everybody just says, they're just blowing off steam. Normally that kind of behavior would be heavily sanctioned, negatively sanctioned. So I just wanted to bring that up so you understand that there are, built into some societies, these letting off steam vows from called moral holidays from the normal norms. Okay, challenges that one faces, sociologists and other researchers, when studying deviance in sports. And it's difficult, as your text points out, for four main reasons. The first one is the types and causes of deviance in sports are diverse, and there are many, so that no single theory can explain them all. Here's their example. For example, just among male college athletes, there is failing to show, if you just take this example, among male college athletes, failing up to show for practice, violating rules, or committing fouls during a game, taking performance-enhancing substances, hazing rookie team members, illegal drugs, binge drinking, engaging in group sex, sexual assault, turning in coursework prepared by others, using painkillers to stay on the field, betting on college sports, destroying hotel property during road trips, taking money from boosters, and meeting an agent at home who gives money to their parents. Okay, those are just a laundry list, but there are more, of course, that are forms of deviance in sports. So it's only a sample of cases reported for athletes at one level of competition over the last decade. That list was just one example of at one level of competition over the past decade. C, the list would be much longer if all athletes were included, obviously, as well as coaches, administrators, team owners, and spectators, because athletes are not, obviously, I hope, the only group in the industry of sports that commit deviant acts. Okay, so therefore, it's important to study deviance in the context in which it occurs. It's important to study anything in the context in which it occurs, but it's particularly complex here studying deviance in sports for the reasons we just talked about. So you have to look at the context in which it occurs and not to look for or expect some single theory that's going to explain the whole situation or explain all cases. The second reason that it's very difficult to study this sociologically is that actions accepted in sports may be defined as deviant in other parts of the society, and actions in society that are accepted in society may be defined as deviant in the sports world. Let's say that again. So actions that are accepted in sports, routinely accepted in sports, can be defined, sometimes are defined as deviant in normal society, regular society, other parts of society. And actions in other parts of society that are regularly happening may be defined as deviant in sports, and we'll go through here and look at this. For example, athletes are allowed, even encouraged, to do things that are outlawed or even criminal in other settings. Okay? Some things that athletes are allowed and sometimes encouraged to do are defined as criminal in other settings. Some things in contact sports would be defined as felony assault in the streets. For example, if some other person came up and assaulted someone in the street the way assault can happen on a football field, the football field is either rewarded or you get a slap on the hand, depending on what happens in this. But if it happens in the street, you can get arrested. Okay? Another example is race car drivers who speed crazily and have wrecks and all of that. That isn't okay in normal non-sports society. Ice hockey players would be arrested for actions that are normal in their games if they were not in the game context. So even when injuries or deaths occur in sports, criminal charges are rarely filed. In addition, sometimes coaches treat players in ways that would be defined as deviant if teachers or employers behaved in the same way. What about bullying a player? Calling a player names by a coach. A teacher or an employer can't get away with that. Not to say they don't do it, but it's very different context, isn't it? Than in the sports world. Another example is team owners in North America don't have to abide by antitrust laws that apply to other businesses. So they can do all kinds of things legally to improve their financial standing that are not legal for other types of businesses because of antitrust laws. Fans act in ways that would alienate friends and family in other settings, or people would define them as being out of control. And conversely, if athletes take the same drugs or supplements used by millions of normal citizens, they may be banned and defined as deviant. Athletes who miss practice games due to sickness or injury are similarly labeled by coaches and teammates, although taking sick days is normal and accepted in everyday life by people who are not athletes. Now, the third reason that this is difficult to study, you can see how complex this is that deviance in sports often involves over-conforming to norms rather than rejecting or not conforming to them. Okay, now, what is over-conforming? Okay, we're going to look at this. In this case of over-conformity, attitudes are super normal. Okay, athletes often go overboard in their willingness to do whatever it takes. They don't set limits on what they're willing to do and have an unqualified willingness to go over the top and exceed normative limits. In other spheres of employment, if you want to call it that, if your boss says, I want you to work, 24/7 this week, people will just say, forget it, I'm not going to do that, or I quit, or whatever. But athletes tend to overperform and do what is asked of them. That's called over-conformity. It's often dangerous, of course, but athletes learn to accept it as, quote, part of the game and as the basis for being accepted in the game culture. And even at extremes, even when athletes are asked to go to extremes and do, at the risk of life and limb and health and a variety of other things, it often brings praise rather than punishment from coaches or fans. So it's even used, this over-conformity, to reaffirm cultural values related to hard work, competition, achievement, and manliness. So over-conforming contradicts the assumption that deviance always involves abnormal or under-conforming behaviors. It doesn't. Deviance is also over-conforming. Okay? And when people don't distinguish between the two forms of deviance, they often define athletes as role models, even though much of what they do is dangerous to health and well-being. The fourth reason this is difficult to study deviance in sports is that training and performance in sports are based on such new forms of science and technology that people haven't yet developed norms to guide and evaluate them. So science and medicine that are used to be for treating people who are sick are now used in sports to enhance performance, right? And because training in sports often pushes the body to such extremes, performance goals often require the use of new medical treatments and technologies. Training substances thought to enhance performance are taken for granted as being part of being an athlete today and living up to the motto of the Olympics, Citius, Altius, Fortius, which is Latin for faster, higher, stronger. So anything that gets you faster, higher, stronger is okay. In that thinking, okay? I'm not saying it is okay. So there's two approaches to studying deviance. When norms are seen as they have this in quotes in the book, and it's important, unchanging truths, okay, then deviance is defined differently than when norms are viewed as social constructions that people create when they interact with one another, which is what they actually are, at least from a social science perspective. So that absolutist approach that norms are unchanging truths assumes that social norms are based on essential principles that form an unchanging foundation for determining good and evil and distinguish right from wrong. So, therefore, in that thinking, that absolutist thinking, all norms represent ideals. And any different idea, remember, ideals is based on the word idea, okay? So all norms represent ideals. And any different idea, trait, or action is deviant in the absolutist perspective. And the more it departs from an ideal, then, obviously, the more serious the deviance. So the most extreme deviations from the ideal for absolutists are often said to be evil or perverse ideas, traits, or actions. For example, if obedience to the coach is a team norm, then any form of disobedience is deviant. Doesn't matter what he's asking you to do, okay? Chronic or consistent disobedience would be seen by absolutists, including most coaches, as evil or a sign of perverted character, or lack of character might be a better way to put it. So the absolutist approach is often used by fans, the media, and the general public when talking about violations and crimes by athletes and coaches. It's important to know and to understand this approach, the absolutist approach, because it helps us to understand how people respond to deviance and why there are so many disagreements when people discuss deviance in sport. Two absolutists, if two people are absolutists, but they have different ideals, okay, such as if one ideal is fair play, then all violations of the game would be deviant. Can you see that connection? Okay, if you're an absolutist and your ideal is that is one of fair play, then all violations of game rules would be considered deviant. But if the other person who's an absolutist's ideal is winning at all costs, well, then a player would be deviant if their team lost because a player refused to commit a statistical foul. A strategic foul. Okay, let's say that again. So if the other person who's an absolutist, if their ideal is winning at all costs rather than fair play, so winning at all costs, then a player would be deviant if they didn't do everything they could get away with, right? Basically, in this example, they give you a strategic foul to win, in order to win at all costs. So, in other words, if we don't share the same ideals, we identify deviance differently as individuals. If we don't share the same ideals, okay? And that's culture, folks. Okay? That's how we've been socialized into what norms have we been socialized into? We have general societal norms and cultural norms. We have norms that we learned in our family, which may be different from those, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to say it one more time. In other words, if we don't share the same ideals, we identify deviance differently. You can look at some of the political arguments and disputes that are going on right now. Okay, and apply that. If we don't share the same ideals, then we identify deviance differently. Absolutism also leads people to see deviance as caused by the character weakness or the flaws of an individual. And that leads to the belief, of course, that the only way to control deviance is more rules, better enforcement of the rules, and severe penalties. Now, this concept that I just mentioned, more rules, better rules, greater enforcement, ignores the reality that people with strong moral character have always engaged in things that are considered deviant by some, such as civil disobedience. They have violated unjust laws. They've challenged unfair and biased norms, producing change and innovation in social worlds. The civil rights movement is an example. The women's movement, the abolitionist of slavery movement. Those are all examples of people who were going against the norms of their society. And the absolutist approach also overlooks that a rigid system of rules and rule enforcement creates fear and guilt that can quench free expression, spontaneity, and creativity. And that's especially applicable, according to many researchers, in the world of sports. Conformity is really important in the world of sports. Okay. So despite all of that we just talked about with absolutists, many, if not most people, are absolutist when they think about deviance in sports. So for example, when an athlete's actions don't meet people's ideals, they define the athlete as deviant. They agree that they agree that the only way to control deviance is to, quote, get tough, get rid of the, quote, bad apples, etc. Don't you ever change the system, right? Just get rid of the deviant, the perceived deviance, who are the athletes from an absolutist perspective. Okay. They don't ask critical questions, the crucial critical questions about ways that laws and rules are created and who creates them and for what reasons. Okay? So think about that. Who creates the laws and rules and why do they create the particular laws and rules? Okay? So most sociologists and other social scientists, as you might imagine, reject absolutism and use what's called a constructionist approach to deviance. A constructionist approach states that deviance occurs when ideas, traits, or actions fall outside the boundaries that people create and that they create and that they use to decide what is acceptable and unacceptable in a social world. I'm going to repeat that for you. Here's the definition of a constructionist approach. It states that deviance occurs when ideas, traits, or actions fall outside the boundaries that people create and use to decide what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior in a social world. It's based on a combination of cultural, interactionist, and structural theories with 6 points. Okay, remember the cultural, structural, and interactionist theories are used all through this text and their sociological concepts to analyze whatever subject we're studying in that chapter. So they're based on on those theories with 6 points. The first one is that people create norms and laws as they interact with each other and use their values to determine a range of acceptable ideas, traits, and actions. And the range of acceptance can be very narrow, as in, say, high security prisons and the military and military combat training and systems of slavery. That's a very narrow range of norms and values. 2, norms and values can be changed. Okay? We've certainly seen that over history, This occurs when people agree to shift the boundaries and define acceptance, U.S. slavery, integration, women's rights, abortion, etc. That the norms and values are shifting with that, at least in a certain group of the society. Those types of things are examples. Of course, when this book was written, there was no concept that the Supreme Court would overthrow the Roe v. Wade stuff. 3, establishment of normative boundaries is influenced by who has power. And there you go. Okay? So people with power and authority generally have the most influence in defining and enforcing norms. And in democracies, powerful people, this is wonderful, right? Since we live in a democracy. In democracies, powerful people can be challenged without violating the norms, right? But not in a dictator or autocracy. In other words, you can demonstrate. You can vote. You can do a whole bunch of things to challenge powerful people. In a democracy, not in a dictatorship or an autocracy, however. 4, there are 2 kinds of deviance, under-conformity and over-conformity, which we have discussed. So 5, here's what deviant under-conformity is when ideas, traits, and actions indicate with someone's ideas, their ideas or their actions indicate a rejection of norms or an ignorance of norms. This happens cross-culturally with people. A lot of cultural misunderstandings. For instance, in America, we think you should look directly in someone's eyes when you're talking to them, right? And if people don't, one considers them often in our culture to be deviant, to be shifty, to be lying, whatever. But in many other cultures, Native American cultures, some Asian cultures, it's very rude to look directly in someone's eyes. So we make assumptions about deviance in people who don't look in our eyes, not understanding, this is just one example, of course, that it's a cultural norm to not do that. It's rude in their culture. So these assumptions we make that people are rejecting norms, in many cases, they don't know about them, or in some cases. Now, the examples your book gives for deviant under-conformity, a rejection of norms. The examples are bar fighting, sexual assault, referring to a person with an intellectual disability as stupid, a coach yelling obscenities to a referee and pushing the ref. Uh, the reason that this is under conformity to social norms is that they don't meet the expectations based on norms or laws of society. Now, anarchy is a condition of widespread deviant underconformity, and that results in general lawlessness, and let's hope we don't get there. So that's underconformity. Underconformity is there are norms. We're all supposed to conform to those norms of behavior. And if you don't conform to them, then that's called under-conformity. Deviant over-conformity is when ideals, traits, and actions go beyond expectations. We talked about that a few minutes ago. Athletes who do anything that's asked of them, even though it's detrimental to their health, for example. Okay, so deviant over-conformity is when ideas, traits, and actions go beyond expectations in ways that are defined by most people as unacceptable. Okay? Example, when an athlete obeys without question a coach's command to keep running in the heat until they collapse from heat exhaustion. And the ultimate example of overconformity is fascism. Just look at the films from Hitler's huge parades and gatherings, right? The fascist gatherings. Boy, you don't even need the word. You don't need. All you need to do is watch to see deviant overconformity. And the definition of that is the definition of fascism, the condition that exists when there is widespread deviant overconformity based on unlimited obedience to norms or to commands of an autocratic leader. Now, let's look at deviant overconformity in sports. It's a significant problem, as your book points out. And a study of this next information comes from a study of bodybuilders and competitive distance runners. Some engaged in unquestioned overconformity in relation to training and competition. They trained so intensely and so often that their health and relationships deteriorated, yet they never questioned their actions or the norms of their sport. Athletes today are more likely to engage in normative traits and do anything to train and participate in sports. So, I'm sorry, I said engage in, it's ignore. Athletes today are more likely to ignore normative traits and do anything to train and participate in sports. High-performance sports athletes are expected to adhere to a code that stresses dedication, sacrifice, and a willingness to put their bodies on the line for their sport and teammates. And conforming to this code is seen as a mark of a true athlete. However, when athletes don't set limits on how far they will go with conformity, then they often engage in deviance, especially in power and performance sports. So they often do things to others in power and performance sports that are deviant. Now, let's look at that sport ethic again and deviance in sports. An ethic is an interrelated set of norms that a group of people use to guide and evaluate ideas and actions. The sport ethic is formed around 4 general norms. But athletes are dedicated to the game above all else. They are expected to love the game and prove it by giving it top priority in their lives. 2, athletes strive for distinction. The Olympic motto, faster, higher, stronger, captures the meaning of this norm. As an example, Justin Wadsworth, a top U.S. Nordic skier in the 2002 Olympics, pushed his body so hard that he suffered internal bleeding. From his hospital bed, he said, "It's pretty special to push yourself that hard." And his coaches and fellow athletes agreed with him. Can you see how deviant that is? How over-conforming that is? Okay. 3, athletes accept risks and play through pain. These are the ethics, right? This is the ethic. Athletes accept risks and play through pain. They are expected to endure pressure, pain, and fear without quitting. And 4, athletes accept no obstacles in the pursuit of success in sports. And this norm stresses the dream and the obligation to pursue it at all costs. So those are the 4 elements of the sports ethic. Most people, the author of this study concluded, accept these 4 norms. They are not unique to sports. Okay. Coakley points this out, that aspects of those 4 points be dedicated to what you're doing. Let's put it in something else, to strive for distinction, to take risks, to accept no obstacles in pursuit of your goal, etc. They're not unique to sports, as he points out. We teach them to our children in order for them to be dedicated to their goals. But unlike in sports, most of us also teach them to set limits and to avoid deviant over-conformity. That is, be dedicated, not obsessive. Work hard, but know when to stop. Suck it up, but don't sacrifice your health. Pursue your dreams, but be realistic in the process. In other words, be sensible. Okay? So that's not normally what happens in the sports world. But even though we have those same values and goals, we teach our children these qualifiers to those things. Okay, so we're going to talk about the current research on brain concussions as an example, and brain injuries in chapter 6. Okay, as an example of using that sports ethic and what can happen if you use it without the qualifiers of, set limits, don't be obsessive, don't sacrifice your health, be realistic, be sensible. Okay. Deviant under-conformity is also a problem. However, when athletes underperform, they are punished immediately, not rewarded and praised. So over-conformity is rewarded and praised. Under-conformity is punished immediately, usually. Who's most likely to over-conform to the norms of the sport ethic? From research, those with a strong need for approval and respect are the ones most likely to over-conform. So, and once again, from research, those with a low self-esteem and a strong need to be accepted and recognized. So these are people who will do anything that's asked of them. They generally, from a personality perspective, are to a greater degree of them than not, have low self-esteem, a strong need to be recognized and accepted. Those who perceive achievement in sports as the surest way to be defined as successful and to gain respect. Those who link their identity as an athlete to their masculinity, so that being an athlete and being a man become a single identity. Those who play on teams in which coaches, makes a lot of sense. Those who play on teams in which coaches and teammates to them make over-conformity an important aspect as a team member. So if you're going to be perceived as a team member, there are teams where over-conformity is a really important aspect of being accepted. However, there are some coaches who keep athletes in a perpetual state of adolescence. This is interesting, okay? by withholding acceptance. And for some, this creates insecurity and makes them dependent on the coach. Uh, I mean, I'm sure you're aware of this, but challenging the masculinity of male athletes is also used as a strategy to ensure and encourage over-conformity. It's used in the military too, calling them derogatory names used for females and things of that nature. Okay. So how does deviant over-conformity and group dynamics operate? Well, being an athlete is, of course, a social experience as well as a physical one. So, team members may create a social world in which over-conformity is normalized. And that's very common. So it's normalized in the sports world and in particular teams, especially, and particular sports especially, even as it's defined as deviant by society as a whole. And as they push the envelope together, the team members push this envelope of over-conformity together, faster, higher, stronger. The bond becomes extraordinarily powerful. And their over-conformity as a team or as an athletes sets them apart culturally and physically from the rest of society. And this leads them to believe that people outside of the sport can't really understand who they are. So, athletes appreciate fan approval, but it's their teammates from whom they receive their affirmation and reaffirmation of their identity as athletes, not from fans. Okay? Because of what they're going through in this ethic of over-conformity, only other athletes understand what it takes. They believe only other athletes understand what it takes to perform. And so everyone else is kind of peripheral to that and to their lives, even often even spouses and family members. So then the next thing that happens is a separation between athletes and the rest of society makes that team group dynamic very, very powerful. And as athletes strive to maintain their identities and membership in the group, they often begin to think of themselves as unique and extraordinary people. And they often hear that as well from coaches and fans and the media, which further supports that concept of themselves as unique and extraordinary people. And that, of course, once we start thinking of ourselves that way, can lead to a form of hubris. Hubris is a pride-driven arrogance and an inflated sense of self-importance. So here's how that happens with athletes. The dynamics leading to hubris among athletes is clear. They bond together in ways that encourage and normalize deviant over-conformity. Collective over-conformity creates a sense of specialness that separates them from the rest of the community. And that leads to a sense of entitlement. We're different, we're better, that kind of thing. And athletes see people outside of their, often, I would qualify this. Athletes often see people outside their sport cultures as incapable of understanding them and their lives. And hubris on teams can create serious problems because it leads to the belief that social norms don't apply to them. Okay? Think of the kind of trouble athletes get into sometimes off the field with norms about violence and sexual behavior and that type of thing. That often comes from hubris, from an idea that social norms don't apply to them. Okay? How do you control deviant over-conformity? Well, it's a big problem because coaches, managers, owners, and sponsors who the people who created and enforce the rules, and they often benefit from over-conformity to the sports ethic. Okay? because the athletes who put their bodies on the line are seen as an exciting way to win games to the fans and media. Therefore, it usually goes unpunished and is often rewarded. And unfortunately, over-conformity often consists of dangerous actions outside of normative boundaries. Here's another complication in trying to control this situation, deviant over-conformity in sports. Another complication: neither money nor the desire to win is the primary reason for pushing beyond limits. It's an athlete's desire to play their sport in a way that sustains the athlete identity, which we're going to talk about more, around which their entire lives are organized. Winning money and fame are important, but they're secondary to reaffirming the identity at the core of their existence, and that involves two important elements. The first one is the deeper meaning and personal issues linked to being an athlete today. The second is the organization of today's high-performance sports, in which athletes must train full-time at a high level of intensity. Now, one way to control deviant over-conformity is to enable athletes to set limits around the norms of the sports ethic. However, this wouldn't be favored by most coaches in elite sports. For example, when a 14-year-old gymnast is late for practice, she's immediately sanctioned. But when the same gymnast loses so much weight and that she becomes dangerously thin, many coaches, parents, and judges don't see deviance as much as a dedicated athlete. Okay. So anorexia is deviant. However you do it, bulimia, anorexia, restricting calories to that extent, that's deviant behavior. But what parents and coaches and fans and other people see is a dedicated athlete in that case. What's the research on deviance in sports? So deviance in the fields, they're in different areas they've studied this. So deviance on the field related to sports is cheating on the field of play. Cheating on the field of play, corruption and harassment in sports organizations, institutional corruption. Then there's sports washing, which we'll in a future chapter look at in detail. Sports gambling, match fixing, match fixing and prop fixing, hazing, and related practices, unfortunately, has become normalized. Now, deviance off the field and apart from sports, you've got crime. We just talked about some of that. Crime, academic cheating, felonies, sexual assault, all under the label of crime. What about performance-enhancing substances and deviance? It's a case study in deviant over-conformity, according to Coakley. Athletes use them for reasons that differ greatly from the reasons that an alienated 25-year-old shoots heroin. Yes, that's true. Completely different reasons. Athletes use them to survive and succeed in elite sports. But as they critically over-conform to their use, they often go too far with them. Doping from the inside in high-performance sports is an example. Okay? And there's supposedly a war on doping. Okay? The World Anti-Doping Code, the WADA, that guides the Olympic sports is enforced by the USADA. There are critical questions to ask about how best to control doping that make people very uncomfortable, so they are seldom asked. And those questions are listed on page 147 if you want to look at them. So there are what are the newer strategies for doping control? A key point is that athletes use performance-enhancing substances not because they lack character or are victims of evil or exploitive coaches, but because they won. This is why athletes tend to use uh, in, performance enhancing substances based on research. One, they uncritically accept and overconform to the norms of the sport ethic. Two, they're part of a sports system in which therapies and supplements are needed to recover from intense training and competition schedules over which they have little control. Three, moral panics over drug use and oversimplified solutions are not going to change the reality of training and competition or the culture of high performance sports. So, four, truly effective control requires both cultural and structural changes. But critical examination of the deep hypocrisy involved in elite power and performance sports shows that, as long as sports federations and teams encourage over-conformity to the norms of the sport ethic, use of performance enhancing drugs will be encouraged, not discouraged. So there needs to be established rules clearly indicating that certain risks to health will not be tolerated in sports. And to establish what's called a harm reduction approach, in which athletes are not allowed to play until certified as well. That's in quotes because that's a technical certification. So until athletes are certified to play, they're not allowed to play until they're certified as well, not simply, quote, able to compete. Could you see the difference between well and able to compete? Might be able to compete and not be well. So they want to change the certification to well and be certified by two independent physicians or medical professionals. And establish injury and health education programs for athletes. This is another way to counteract the use of performance enhanced, the overuse of performance enhancing drugs, is to let athletes know what that actually does to one's body. Another tactic would be to establish a system of transparency and accountability for medical staff and sports scientists who work for athletes, teams, and sports federations. And the last and final point is to make drug and substance abuse education a key part of health and education programs. So that's the end of the chapter on deviance and sports.